The first time I acquired an artwork, it was a bronze figure, barely 1 foot tall, a woman carrying a bunch of shaluk flowers on her head, her sari wrapped purposefully around her waist in her gait. There is both rhythm and resolve. The simple dignity drew me to the piece and also the artist. Lady of Chaluk Flowers is a bronze sculpture by none other than Meera Mukherjee, or Meera Di as I knew her. In those days, she was often known to be temperamental at times, and I would climb up the stairs to her Paddapukur house. I would fear it may be my last visit. Thankfully, it never quite came to that. Instead, quite the opposite, as I felt our association grew warmer over the years. And I dare say ours became a little more than a professional relationship. Meera Mukherjee was an artist through and through. One of the things I found greatly inspiring about Meera Di was precisely this. Although she was an artist who refused to be accommodated within existing professional or social structures if it meant any compromise with her individual or artistic principle, she was never alone. She had, or I should say, she built her own world, which she nurtured and supported, and in turn was nurtured by all. One can see the culmination of the community engagement in her monumental Buddha sculpture, assembled by her team, her family after her passing. Whenever I try to recall the time I spent with Meera Di, I never know where to begin or end. During one of these conversations, M.F. Hussain had interjected, since you have an unending supply of stories about Meera, why don't you do a book on her? Over the years, this thought stayed with me. With Meera Di's centenary approaching, the time suddenly felt right. Things slowly started coming together. The first time I read Taupati's writing, it happened to be a piece on Meera Mukherjee in a Mark publication on woman artists. And then our conversations began. I was struck by the rigor of her research and her ability to capture the spirit of an artist. Back in the day, Meera Di had introduced me to Arun Ganguly, who had a tremendous archive of her practice, and we hosted an exhibition of these photographs in Gallery 88. Taupati and Adip Datto were the curatorial forces behind the exhibition, and now this book. The enthusiastic and imaginative participation of 3 other scholars, Jigisha Bhattacharya, Anuja Mukherjee, Shujan Mukherjee. The remarkable design was done by Shukarna Ghosh, and numerous public galleries and private collectors to Shomik Bandyopadhyay, and of course Jadavpur University Press and Mark for coming on board for this publication. Thank you.
Thank you. Marg is very pleased to be associated with this book. Like she said, Marg has published a little bit about Meera Mukherjee, as we have about a lot of artists. But it's really a pleasure to see a book of this size given to an artist of her caliber. I'd like to quickly introduce the speakers, even though I think most of you know them well. Tapti Guha Thakurta is a senior art and cultural historian who has written widely on modern Indian art, art institutions, and public visual culture. Until 2019, she was professor of history at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. Adip Datta is a practicing artist with his focus on drawing and sculpture. He is a teacher in the sculpture department at the Faculty of Visual Arts, Rabindra Bharati University, Calcutta. And Abhay Sardesai, of course, who we are very pleased to have with us today, was the editor of Art India from 2002 to 2024. He has taught at the University of Mumbai, SNDT and TIS. Abhay writes in English and translates from Marathi Konkani and Hindi. We'd also like to quickly thank Gallery 88, Pundoles, and the Jadavpur University Press for putting together this lovely book and this event. And now I'll hand it over to our speakers.
It's always a pleasure participating in an event hosted by 88, and thank you, Mrs. Banerjee. It's always a treat. And also being here in Dadiba's wonderful space, which has always been very welcoming. And it's a little daunting, I must say, to be on the same panel as Taupati and Odeep. Odeep, of course, I know for a long time because he wrote for me at Art India. And so did you, of course.
2004.
Yes, onwards.
Long time.
So thank you very much for making time for this wonderful event. It's a discussion that is sort of anchored around a book that promises to introduce us to a glorious, great artist and her world over an arc of time that delves into, pardon me for saying this, Bhadralok life in colonial Bengal, explores the continuous give and take between the village and the city, something that Odeep writes about, and touches on the transforming nature of art making through the post-independence period, and the creation of impressive sculptures, abidingly so from the 60s to the 90s. Known for her metal cast work, Meera Mukherjee remains one of India's and Indian art's most reclusive presences, who pushed the boundaries of what art was and how it could be. Taupati, as editor and writer of this book, along with Odeep and Sujan Mukherjee, arrive at an exploration of Meera Mukherjee's métier through a variety of formal modes. The superb biographical essay by Taupati is complemented by Odeep's considered, systematically tabulated tract that revolves, amongst other things, around her very elaborate process. You also have a conversation between Taupati and Odeep, which brings out what one might call an interpretative elucidation about individual works and their specific contexts, and also the enjambment, the leakage between them. Apart from the polymath Shomik Bondopadhyay's personal essay on the artist, especially which hovers around the mentor figure, Nirmal Sengupta, what really lifts the book, Nirmal Bose, and the other essays by Nirmal Bose, what really lifts the book are the translations of Mukherjee's Bastar journal from the early 60s and her other diaries from the 70s. Listen to this pithy observation from the Bastar journal. I'm just going to read out. It's really fantastic. Sorry. So this is from her Bastar journal. Bastar, as you know, is a place in middle India, and it was parts of which were shared between 3 or 4 states after independence. It was largely a tribal Adivasi kingdom, and it's known very, very well for its Dokra work. In this wonderful diary that she kept when she visited the place in the 60s for the very first time, she says, she visits the melas and she visits the workshops of these Adivasis, and she makes an observation. She says, if there was a mishap or some unfortunate incident in a household, after they purchased a new idol, they would go and put the figure in this jail. In other words, the idol of a deity would be sent to prison. I found there many beautiful idols of different shapes and sizes huddled together. surprisingly, no one tried to take the jailed idols away, and jail is a word that they used. Whoever had placed their idol there, hoping to rid themselves of misfortune, would return to take them back home as soon as the tides turned. Of course, I can only speak of what I saw so many years back. I don't know how things are today. I think it's a fascinating and very, very perceptive, very searing way of looking at tribal culture in the 60s. It's changed, of course, just as Bastar art has changed, just as tribal art, however contentious the proposition of tribal art, has changed a lot in the country. So the peculiar curiosity that is at once academic but also empathic that we see in Meera Mukherjee's foray into tribal art, which then becomes some kind of a life-affirming journey, is what the book seeks to understand, among a host of other features. What quests does an artist embark on when she also hosts an anthropologist under her skin? This is a question, I think, which has centrally occupied both Taupati and Adeep and several other of the contributors. And I think it's also something that sort of troubles us as we see a lot of her work now in this context. So as we trace the early life as a, what one might call a Sukhavastu, Savarna, Madhyam Vargiya woman, through a failed marriage, displacement, travels, apprenticeships, studies in Germany, we come face to face with a woman who is assiduous in her desire to uncover meaning in work that is both artisanal and artistic, individualistic and collaborative. So Taupati's essay seamlessly weaves family details, growth stories, and insights from all her art practice stations to create a three-dimensional picture of a woman who is at once stubborn, passionate, giving, intense, and also quite alone. An artist who experiments with material that includes scrap, dung, straw, clay, and who more than most of her confreres is overwhelmingly aware of labor, its politics, and its dynamics. Now, talking about her confreres, Taupati, I'm curious to know why one key vector of historicization has been elided over. And I was just talking to Chaitanya about how important a figure you have been for all of us. Those of us who have... No, you, Taupati. No, those of us who have followed your art historical writings, and also the curious sort of marriage of imagination and rationality that you have brought to steady through your gaze on all the different fields and areas that you have worked on, whether it is the Durga Puja or whether it is the art of the nation and the idea of the nation in pre-colonial Bengal. So this is something that I have been quite curious to know from you, why this vector of historicization has been elided over in the book, which is that of situating Meera Mukherjee in a context that includes other sculptors from a generation before hers, like say Bej, and sculptors, many of them women like Pilu Pochkhanawala, who were her contemporaries. In fact, Pilu and she share the same birth year.
Classmates also.
Exactly. Also, these artists share certain practices, or at least traits in their practices, that have a lot of kinship and that are often quite disparate at the same time. Also, extended discussions about the Delhi Polytechnic, the IFACs, the Shilpi Chakra, and other such important institutional presences and collectives would have been really very useful and apposite for the reader to understand the Sijjist, of course, but also the mahal of her sort of growth. Also sort of artists that you refer to, like Amina Ahmed, Karuna Shah, about whom you have written earlier, and Shanu Lahiri, okay, also come to mind, some of whom were her college fellows. I think maybe
They were all in Europe
at the same time, yes. What also brings Mukherjee alive in this magnificent book is are Arun Ganguly's photographs. Now, he catches her in a variety of acts and so also a variety of moods. At work, at her makeshift furnace, shoulder to shoulder with laborers, hacking at scrap metal, breaking molds of a caste. However, an image that has stayed with me is the one where Meera points out something in a book that is held by Nirmal Sengupta, who was also her partner in life. I think that's a great photograph. There's a sense of togetherness here that is elusive. You know, a moment anchored in the act of seeing and reading and responding. It's a shared engagement of two people in a world where text opens to image and vice versa. The two important works that come to mind, if I was to continue in the same key, are, as we celebrate the artist and as we celebrate the book, are Akash and Jhokal. Both of them, I think, from 1995 and 1990 respectively, and both of them in metal. The protagonist's gesture in both these works is similar. She holds on to a frame and attempts to break free from it at the same time. I think at this moment, which is a moment of what one might call poetic lucidity, may I ask Tapati to come forth and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhay, for this wonderful introduction. I should begin not as a self-defense, but just to say this was a new kind of book for me, because as Abhay rightly pointed out, my work has never been focused on a single artist. So I've generally not done catalogue essays. I've done the odd small biography of Karuna Shah. And I've always had a sense that it's not always about the great artist, but it is about thinking of a figure located in their own times. So the Meera Mukherjee book came to me as a challenge because it was a deep dive and deep focus on a single person. Again, without trying to fall into the eulogistic mode of celebrating a great artist. So one of the things that I wish to understand, and I must say here, compared to Adeep and Shupriyadi, I did know her, but never that closely. I was in awe of her. I was also, she could be extremely temperamental. She did not always warm up to others. So, but I've done it. I've tried to step back and think about a life, an extraordinary life, lived through extraordinary times too. So yes, this is what the book does not do, is place her in a larger context of modernism, modernist art, other sculptors, other women artists, though she herself was very resistant to that tag. When I went to interview her for the Marg book, she did not want to be considered in that slot of a women artist. She was part of a group which she left. So she had her own concerns, and yet it is really her career as a single woman, stepping out of many societal norms at that time, which adds to the struggle of her life. So it's not a defense, but to say, yes, there is still a lot of scope for thinking about her in the context of her contemporaries, in the context of institutions. I wish I could have done more in thinking about the Delhi Polytechnic at that time and the Shilpi Chakra. I just touch upon these. I don't do very much more. Similarly, her time in Europe. And this idea that everything about you is Indian, but why is it that you work like the rest of us? This is a challenge that all Indian artists face, but particularly women, that they said they were there to steal the thunder of modernism for their own art. And yet, there was a way in which you had to be continuously returned to where you began. And that's a larger struggle within modernism. When Meera Mukherjee is confronted with the same question, she has a different take on it. But she does say it left her sleepless for nights to prove herself. So it is really in Munich that the struggle to prove herself began. Now, I do have slides, and I'm wondering whether I should give you all a bit of a visual sense of where we are. So I'll begin by, so we can come back to why was this close focus on Meera Mukherjee alone? We wanted to, you could say for me, it was an experiment of doing a book of this size on one artist alone. But we wanted to make it an art cum archival book because we had access to photographs which were truly exceptional. We had access to some of her papers that had been archived by Gallery Rasa. We had access to her writings. And the other thing is, there are layers of her own writings, not just the diaries, her reminiscences, and her book Metal Craftsmen of India, and also another book called In Search of Vishwakarma. We took the title from, so here is, I like to think of it as a self-portrait, but it's called Mother Earth. It's with MAP Bangalore. And this is a piece of her with her dog, and that appeals to me a lot. Bhulu was a central part of her life and would travel with her from her Bhawanipur home to her Elachi home and back. So I just begin with this. But I'd like to dwell a bit like Abhay on this metaphor we use called the depth of the mold. It's taken from a writing of hers. In Bangla, it's called Chacher Gobhir Theke. And the English translation closest would be from the depth of the mold. So we use the metaphor of an elaborate mold making and lost wax process of metal casting, which Adip will talk about a bit more, to look closely at the themes of material and technique, labor and work, struggle and resilience in her life story. I'll begin with a brief quotation where the artist recounts her experience of a night-long process of casting. It's part of a small. During casting, the next please. During casting, she writes, my heart and soul intertwine with the world as one. This inseparability brings with it certain experiences which manifested themselves in strange and surprising forms. Like a patient struggling to breathe, the burning mold suffers, and I suffer with it. I do not know how to bring the situation under control, even though I fully comprehend the precarity of the process. Who is it that whispers these warnings to me? It is that being who is breathed into life in the heat of that clay mold, which reveals itself from the great depths of the mold and is no less a living, breathing thing than I. Again, an amazing reflection. And it is a small extract from a much larger quotation. As a heart, mind, and body becomes one with the object in the furnace, each act of metal casting was for her a kind of trial by fire. The liquid burning metal that she was pouring in, she knew, could be unruly and temperamental, not unlike herself. Both needed to be handled with the same discipline and care. With each of her metal work emerging out of the mold, with or without flaws, Meera Mukherjee was continuously recasting herself. So this is the metaphor. We like to think that she is also emerging each time from the depth of a mold. This extract, which I quoted, is published much later alongside her diary of 1970, and I can talk later on how these fragments of diaries is quite contingent on what survives. These were published in Bengali, one of them in her lifetime, the rest later. So they're diaries of 70, 74, and 76, but there would have been much more. They just happened to survive. This period, the 70s, is a crucial juncture in her career when, following her extensive countrywide survey of traditions of metal craftsmanship, she began experimenting full force with her chosen reinvented practice of metal casting in the indigenous lost wax method. Again, I'll leave that to Adip to explain further. Signposting this juncture, next one please, are two of Meera Mukherjee's early and most significant works in the sculpting idiom. One of these titled, it'll come back. Oh, one of these titled He Who Saw, and therefore my She Who Saw is really based on this, was made in 1968. It's one of her first attempts at a near life-size work, made in 8 parts and welded together, where the figure and form is directly inspired by the Ghodua tribal sculptures of Bastar, which she had closely encountered during her survey of this region. The other work which signposts this junction is a monumental elegiac figure of Emperor Ashoka at Kalinga, laying down his sword, as enormous in its conception and ambition as in its scale, made in 26 parts. This was a work which confronted her with some of her greatest challenges of funds, construction, and multi-sectional casting. Begun in 1969 as a pacifist statement in a Calcutta engulfed with the violence and police brutality of the Naxalite movement, and a diary of 1970 is very full of these references. Her Ashoka took several years to be completed and faced many more years of uncertainty, moved from her home to the airport hotel in Calcutta, moved back, before it found a permanent home in the lawns of the ITC Moria in New Delhi, where actually it stands forgotten. I know lots and lots of people in Delhi who are not really aware that such a fabulous piece of work is standing there. Okay. Now, I'll run through the remaining presentation without reading it. So here, Abhay has already talked about the diversity of her training. Okay, sorry. This is important to reflect upon, that her training is, firstly, she's never formally schooled, even though she's coming from a very elite kind of Bhadralok family, where the rest of her family are very highly educated. So she has that cultural capital she grows up in, but it's only at the age of 13 or 14 that she first joins the Indian Society of Oriental Art. So the photograph shows a young Meera Mukherjee of 13 or 14 years old with her elder brother and sister from her years. So from Indian style painting, it was almost like an accomplishment for women students. It never really trained you to be professional. She ends up in Delhi through a marriage which never worked. She finds herself in Delhi Polytechnic at a very crucial juncture, 47 to 51, crucial juncture in the nation's modern art history, in the capital's modern art history. And among her contemporaries are several modernists, Amina Ahmed Kaur, her teacher is Dhanraj Bhagat, and there are many others. Then she has a brief, informal training under an Indonesian artist, Kwasuma Afandi, in Shantiniketan, but interestingly, she's not part of Kala Bhavan, nor is Afandi. He and Nandalal Bose never got on that well. So she first meets Afandi in the Delhi Polytechnic when he comes to give a talk. Later, when she returns and going through a very difficult time, her family never accepted her coming away. She's left without a home. Afandi comes as a reprieve, gives her a purpose in life, and she goes through a very intense period of mentorship. This is her painting in oil of Afandi's wife, Mariati Afandi. You can see she's working in a variety of styles now. Next. And then comes Munich. It's part of an Indo-German fellowship, a technical training fellowship, where she goes to train in sculpture under Tony. Initially, she's in painting, also in printmaking, but she says she wanted to lose herself in the sheer physical labor of work, which is why she joined the sculpture department, where she's trained. She's called Meera Devi then. She was Meera Goswami after her marriage, and she would become Meera Mukherjee again. But in between, she's referred to that, and we see her in a student group exhibition. Now, so as I said, what is important to note is this diversity of her training, long training from 1937 to 56. She's already in her mid-30s when she returns. And it kind of maps a the larger history of modern and modernist art education in the country, including the travels abroad. 50s is when so many modern Indian artists, including women, on government fellowships are going abroad. Now, Abhay has already talked about the aspect that fascinated me a lot, which is her persona as an anthropologist. The next one, please, yeah. It's a very blurred photograph, but it's the only one we found of her in the field. Now, clearly, Meera Mukherjee is not the only modern Indian artist of pre- and post-independence India who's delving into the subjects and styles of tribal and folk art from the vantage position of a modernist artist. She's clearly not the only one. There's a long and rich tradition. But what marks her out is the way she embraces the role of an anthropologist and undertakes journeys deep into the tribal forested heartland of India with Bastar as her main thing. And these travels involve the kind of physical endurance and mental determination that would single her out amongst her contemporaries and would instill in her, and this is again something I mentioned already, a degree of knowledge and empathy with these artisans, as much with their working techniques as with their ritual, myths, and way of life that would become the distinct mark of her alterity as an artist. Now, she makes her first trip to Bastar as a self-sponsored trip. It's enabled by Nirmal Sengupta, who's already an important figure in her life emerging, friend of her elder brothers, but who becomes her main support. He's then looking after the Dandakaranya rehabilitation project in Bastar, and that's where she arrives. What's also interesting is, after that she enters institutional fellowships, and her first of these are with the regional design centers. So first she goes to the Bronze Casting Center in Bangalore, where she works with upper caste bell metal workers. Then she comes to the Regional Design Center in Calcutta, and we know several modern artists of that time are involved with Weaver Studies Centers, with regional design centers. This coming together of modern art with craft and design is really a widespread trend in the 50s and 60s, and she's part of this. Next, please. It's at the Regional Design Center in Calcutta that she first encounters the work that has come to be known as Dokra. It's interesting that this craftsman said that this is not a term we ever used. It's something that is coming into being, and now even Bastar art is called Dokra. It's there that she meets the craftsmen of Deriapur and Gushkara, which are from from the districts of Bardhaman and Birbhum, and trains under Prabha Sen. And we see here experiments that designers and modern artists were bringing already in scale and scope. Okay? Now, what is important to note is also how she comes into contact with a network of anthropologists. That itself was not a given. It's through Nirmal Sengupta that she meets Surajit Sinha, and through Surajit Sinha, Nirmal Bose, who's then head of the Anthropological Survey of India, and who then places his faith. He's deeply interested in caste and community and is willing to place his bet on a practicing sculptor to study metal crafting techniques in communities, look at caste mobilities, caste mutations, and classifications according to caste, according to region, according to forms of metal alloys and manufacturing process, and objects that they produced. So on one hand, Nirmal Bose placed his bet on Meera Mukherjee, and she rose to the vocation. Now there's a mind-boggling map of her travels that she undertakes between 62 and 64. The heart of it is again Raipur, Bastar. But then she moves through western Orissa, through the western districts of Bengal into Chaibasa, Ranchi, Hazaribagh. And she discovers here a core community of folk artisans of a connected though scattered kinship, from whom she would take away the most in terms of a lost wax method of metal casting. Now, again, I say it's quite remarkable how a Bhadra Mohila, single, middle class, around 40, continuously facing suspicion and even lack of trust from craftspeople. So that's something, it was not smooth. The first people she met refused to teach her. They often made her go through very demeaning, grinding processes before. So to gain trust, to understand, is a huge class and culture gap, but she takes on that challenge. And here she's traveling by foot, by bus, by bullock cart, by all modes of transport over 2 years, covering the south, the east, the north, and on to Kathmandu in Nepal. The final product of, the other thing is she comes armed not just with a field note diary, but with a sketchbook. So instead of photographs, the next one, what we have is her detailed documentation, really, of metal materials, techniques of making, objects, making this technique section of the book the biggest and thickly illustrated. And we have liberally used these little drawings all over the book. And the final product of her survey, Metal Craftsmen of India, next one please, it was published years later by the ASI, remains a forgotten masterwork in this field. And I use the word masterwork with the thing that it is dry, but it is meticulously documented. What is also remarkable is that long before the Metal Craftsman comes out, she's publishing. She's publishing even in the Dandakaranya Samachar, in journals like Forum, Rooplekha, Man in India, and writes an earlier book called Folk Metal Craft of Eastern India for the All India Handicrafts Board. Now the next theme that directly emerged is, of course, the next one again. Okay, next. Okay, is her conscious self-positioning as a worker. Now, there's both an intensity to the self-positioning as well as many, many currents of tensions and contradictions. And I was trying to be sensitive to both. That there's a larger worldview of these metal craftsmen, the frugality and hardship of their existence, and their complete immersion in the labors of making, all of which she wished to graft on to her own way of life and dismantle the divide between the artist and the artisan. And yet, all along, she would never forfeit the singularity of her own position vis-à-vis the work team or vis-à-vis the craftsmen she had encountered. So that is the duality with which she's working, trying to embrace another life, but at the same time, a recluse but exhibiting. Her works are beginning to sell. She's going to the Kasoli Art Center to participate in a camp. More than many other artists of her time, by the 80s, her works are selling. She's exhibiting. But, so this is the duality I look at a bit. Her mode of work was such that it involved not just immense physical toil on her part, but other helping hands as well. Next slide. So this brings into the picture two early craftspeople she drew from the All India Handicrafts Board in the Regional Design Center in Calcutta, one of whom was from Dariyapur, who actually helped her with her metal casting techniques. And the other one was somebody called Nimai Bhaskar, who was actually a woodworker, who she literally drew in, began to stay with her, and became her most trusted helping hand and aid, and remained with her right till the end, and was in charge of finishing her last Buddha. Now, she becomes a trusted aid. Now, we also have Arun Ganguly's detailed photographic documentation next of different phases of her work at a small home in 12A Padmapukur Road, and then in a village work unit at Elachi on the outskirts of Calcutta. What also struck me was the constant anxiety, tension, and worry with which she worked. The worry was about something going wrong in the metal casting, the wastage of funds, this, you know. Here is somebody who's continuously worried about money and where she will get funds for the next phase of casting, and to think of the market value of Meera Mukherjee's works now. But that is the thing, she's continuously worried. So it's almost like the artisan who's seasonally working needs to sell to work again. She's also continuously in search of a secure place for metal casting. And in the early years, she has to move, next please, she has to move between different industrial sites in the city for casting. Her molds have to be stored in the veranda of her Bhavanipur house, and figures like Ashoka and many large figures she did were left standing in a tiny courtyard in front of her house waiting for a buyer. They were not commissioned works, and therefore there was always uncertainty about where it would go. Now, central to her life, as Abhay said, is the companionship with Nirmal Sen Gupta. This is the picture. Yeah. So he emerges as really an intellectual and emotional pivot of her life in Bhavanipur. He's a married man. He has his own home. But they develop a life together which is outside all societal norms, lived together, but somewhere their closeness is never in question, but the terms of the relationship was something they came to terms with. Now, it is Nirmal Sen Gupta who enables her move to Elachi Gram, a move away from the city, next please, a village on the outskirts of Calcutta, now no longer village, that would emerge as an integral part of her work cycle and a model of community life. A long-time communist and trade unionist, Nirmal Sen Gupta had begun in this area, in a village called Nalgor Hat, a school for local children that he named Dhankhet Vidyalay. This grassroots project grew into a broader literacy movement, ran 8 schools, etc., had a health center manned by the locals. Meera Mukherjee would go with Nirmal Babu there every Sunday morning to teach the village children. Lessons in alphabets and numbers soon expanded into drawing and painting classes. Next, she started to develop, the next picture please, a larger Kantha project with the women of the vicinity, often the mothers of the children. The one before, please. Okay, is one gone missing? Oh, yeah, this is the one I was thinking. So it's a beautiful drawing she calls the Women of Dhankhet Vidyalay. And this is one of the Katha projects at work. Audip has written at length on this. I would say it evolves as a novel form of community art practice under her tutelage and guidance. So this emerges out of her move to Elachi. More importantly, Elachi provides her with her own space for her elaborate work of metal casting. It set into place a seasonal working pattern in which the Padmapukur house was where the bulk of the work with clay cores, wax models, and outer casing would be carried out through the year, to be later transported to Elachi, and the winter months spent there, where the enormous labors of casting and breaking of the crucibles would be carried out night after night. Next, please. The artist, her head covered in a gamcha, clad in her casting shoes, often with a face mask, would be there with the team directing every stage of the process. She had to be there in person because every stage needed her direction. Elachi allowed her to assemble a much larger work team, consisting largely of day laborers drawn from the locality. They were not skilled in any particular craft, but what they offered was hard work, networks for gathering material ranging from clay, beeswax to metal parts, fuel and firewood, and a propensity for learning under her guidance. What is remarkable is also the forging of a mode of community living at the home at Elachi that Meera Mukherjee and Nirmal Sen Gupta cultivated through an ethics of austerity and sharing. Next, please. Again, Arun Ganguly's photographs from the 1990s stand witness to the community life at Elachi. A long open balcony, the image on the right, where the cooking and the waxwork was done in one corner, was where everybody congregated on the floor for simple meals. Indoors was the artist's studio, come living, come bedroom. Next, please. Where, as a German visitor writes, Meera lived surrounded by books, paintings, photographs, and sculptures, where she worked and received guests, where she sang, read, and slept. There was also a small art community and a salon that grew around her in this non-urban setting, with a regular flow of scholars, art connoisseurs, and collectors. And this is not to be ignored. There was also a team of art college students who began to participate in her casting work. Largely, they gathered around her following some casting workshops she had held in Elachi and at Goalpara in Shantiniketan. In some of Arun Ganguly's photographs, next, we see the artist exhibiting her season's freshly cast sculptures on the open grounds of the Elachi house, standing among her works, showing them to her visitors and potential buyers. In fact, the piece she's holding on to is in the map collection. It's a beautiful piece of a mother and child. So from the 1980s, her sculptures, despite her life of reclusion, a kind of seclusion and being away in Elachi, her works were regularly being exhibited in the city and elsewhere and was attracting a steady stream of buyers. We get a sense of prices from the notes we have, it's there in the book, or what she was selling for. It was always tied to the cost of metal and material, and that's interesting that she would actually have a buyer, she would lay down the weight of wax and metal and then think of a price to put on it. One of the major exhibitions of her work was outside Calcutta, was organized here in Mumbai. The Goethe Institute remained one of her biggest supports since the Munich days. It was held here by the Goethe Institute and the Alliance Francaise in 1983. That's when Geeti Sen, who's written extensively on her, first came across her work. The other very big exhibition was held, which is still, I think, the largest solo exhibition of her works ever, was held in 1993 in the lawns of the Birla Academy. Next, please. Where again Arun Ganguly provides us with a very detailed visual documentation of this exhibition, which spread from the first floor gallery into the lawns of the Birla Academy. I think I'll end there because I have really kind of gone over my time limit. I did have some of the sculptures to show, maybe I'll just go through them. So I wanted to end. So one thing that is absolutely crucial to her life, sorry. Oh, sorry. Can I be heard? Yeah. Okay. Is music. So the discipline and rigor of a training as a classical vocalist with Bimala Prasad Chattopadhyay, and the way music becomes an integral part, both the same rigor and discipline she brings to her work of sculpting, she brings to her music. The two go together, and music becomes a very important component in her sculptural repertoire. So this one is of her herself playing the Esraj. Next, there are several themes she does in music, but this one on Amjad is absolutely fabulous. It's in the NGMA Bangalore. So it's in this place between the city and the village, between leisure and work, between stillness and restlessness, that her sculptures emerge from the small to the monumental. Sometimes the small itself has a great monumental quality to it, like the women with the shaluk flower. And again, it's the theme of work. Next. So from gods and goddesses who take on the form of village deities, maybe like the jailed gods and goddesses she saw in Bastar, to melded groups. Next. From painting to sculpture, the figure of the waters, the fishermen, the boatmen, the oarsmen, fishermen throwing their nets. Next. This is a very small piece with Pranab Ranjan Rai, but we see the monumentality of just the net. Next. And then we have themes coming in from urban life. This is part, on the left, is part of two called the earth carriers. This was during the metro construction in Calcutta, and these were workers carrying cables. So it's a pair, a man and a woman. We see the woman here. The woman is in Calcutta, and the man is in MAP Bangalore. I think they should be brought together and reinstalled. You have the minibus, which is the work we saw emerging out of the mold. There's a lot she does on urban forms, tiny figures in a metro, coming out of a train, in a passport office, in a minibus. Next. she works with a consolidated metal form too, where she begins to use calligraphy and dense kind of inscription of work. Several of this form. This one is called the Ratha Yatra. There is a Ferris wheel. There's River of Life. And then we have these figures, large ones, figures of deep contemplation. Next. Okay, sometimes they're actual life incidents she relates to a piece. This is a very important one because we have no trace of this work. Mohan was a young worker in Dhankhet Vidyalaya who was found dead, killed as a part of political violence. He was found dead on a bicycle. So she makes these two pieces, one Mohan lying dead on the cycle, and the other Mohan carrying the whole village on his head, bit like Krishna and Mount Govardhana. And they were her tribute to this young man who died. I don't know whether we know where Mohan carrying the village on his head is, but certainly this work on the left disappeared. Okay, fine, next. Okay, now this is the figure he already mentioned, Abhay, Ihokal, a woman at the loop. These are her large pieces. Balmiki is actually meant to be based on her guru Bimala Prasad, or Bimala Charan, but it's called Balmiki. So these are works of medium size, but we think of stillness, quiescence, contemplation. Next. Portraits. This is an amazing portrait of Nirmal Sengupta. We don't know where the work is again. So again, Arun Ganguly's photograph often remains our only document. Next. This is one of my favorite pieces. It's of the poet Shukanto, a poet who dies very young, where he's holding up the pages of one of his poetry called Obak Prithivi, the wondrous world. So this idea of text and image, she begins to densely calibrate her with textual work. Next. I end by saying, where does the artist's persona rest? In this contemplative posture of a seated woman, where there are many of them, or in the force of a dancing Nataraj, where the force of motion almost seems to spring out of the body, it begins to fly. And at the end, I think we will all agree that it comes to rest in her last work, the Buddha. Next. Okay. Where she conceives of it, but does not live to finish it. It's finished by her team. It journeys from outside Adip's house to the hilltop where it stands. A work of modern art is transformed into a devotional icon on the hilltop of Badamtam, where another community of laborers, the tea plantation workers, treat her as a worshipped icon with prayer flags. There's no name, provenance, or artist there. Only those who know about Meera Mukherjee make that artistic pilgrimage to the top of a hill to see it. But I think here the work of art is transformed into a devotional icon, and I'll just end with one line that I write, where I say, the iconic image achieves its highest purpose in becoming one with its maker. To stand before her Buddha is to sense the artist breaking free of her artistic ego, throwing it to the wind sweeping the mountains, and disappearing within the luminescence of a final creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapati, for this very brief but comprehensive, quite brief, I mean, considering the span of her life.
Good for me.
Odeep now.
Yes. Good evening to all of you. Today this word, quote unquote, Bhadralok came up several times, and she would always use the word Bhadralok in a derogatory sense, and that is a statement in itself. She would say that I'm always very scared about, again, the quote unquote Bhadraloks. And she was the ultimate Bhadralok. Absolutely. But but she would also add the half-educated Bhadraloks. So I said that it is always a statement in itself. You see, yes, there are so many archival materials, and we had an access to it, and they also sort of almost organically came to us. But I had her memories. It was in the mid-80s, and I was in my formative years that I was taken to her by a few friends, and I'd gone with a sense of dejection, and instantly there was a connect, and that is how it all started. I was attracted to the person. I'm not sure about the sculptures at that point of time. I was drawn to the personality and the books that were there. Beautiful, beautiful books on art and archaeology. So that is how it all started, and I never thought of the sculptures, nor the material, nor nothing. And it is only now that I'm into some sort of a practice that I look back and I see the past from the standpoint of the present, and that is it's almost like a window that I from time to time I open, and I communicate with a person who's no more. Meera Mukherjee, when I used to go there, I would always see her working with material, and material was very important to her entire practice, and she would say that art without the material is nothing. So that itself says what she considered art to be, and how material was important. She would say another thing quite often, and that's art through science, and science meaning technology. We all know that she worked with the indigenous artisans, the craftspersons, and it was a body of knowledge that she reflected on, she learned, but also at the same time she was constantly improvising, and she was altering that process. And there was an attempt to relocate that body of knowledge that is located in the rural setup, and to bring it to the city where she belonged to. She would often say that the artisans, that she doesn't have the commitment of an artisan to make the deities that they make. So she would say that, but I have my own commitments, and and they lies with the people that I work with. And as I said that Bhadralok has always been used in a derogatory sense, and I too come from that Bhadralok genetry, again quote unquote, but it didn't really matter at that point of time. I knew that we shared the same neighborhood, that 12A Padmapukur Road where she lived, and 35 Balaram Bosch where I lived. These are two different spaces, never to come together, or maybe never to be allowed to overlap. I saw her working with the car welders, car mechanics, and she was constantly referring to a group of artisans who've come from the village and settled in the city. So that element of, what should I say, in sociological term, it said, the push of the village and the pull of the city, that is what was important to her. And she was always looking at how the indigenous technique was being applied onto a different kind of a situation, completely different. And that is what she did herself. She referred to the indigenous technique, of course, but also at the same time, in certain ways, she negated that, and it was her own technique. It was not the dokra that we understand, but because as a sculptor, I always thought that it would have been much easier and economic also for her sort of to simulate a surface which is, an archaic surface that she's contemplated, she's responded to the pre-Greek figurines while, as a student in Europe. And the reason that she wanted to come back to India, because she thought that, there's a living tradition of these figures in India, which Europe has lost, and that was why she came back, and that is also why she went to Japan, because she thought that there are artisans who are Buddhist, practicing Buddhist, and that is what she wanted to interact with them. But I've always thought that she could have easily cast some of her pieces, creative pieces, with the artisans that she was working with or learning the techniques from. But she never did it. And I would say that because, the pieces that she fashioned could have never been done in the process that they were working in. And so she had to invent a technique of her own. She had to but the knowledge of the material that the artisans use was important, because when she shifted from the village to the city, she was looking for material that would, play the same role and function of the material that she's seen in these villages. She's used, the artisans would use paddy husk, and she, in Calcutta, would use hay straw. And both played the same. Now these are little innovations, these are little alterations that she made, and those material contributed to the body of her sculpture. It is definitely not, because often people say that these are kind of dokra works. It is not. Yes, she's used the wax coiling. Why? I believe it was sort of to unlearn what she's learned in these institutions. It was not easy for her to sort of to unlearn what she's learned. So those coiling, those processes were important. But she's always, and that is the reason why she was part of the casting. Most of the time, I've always thought that most of her other contemporaries, mostly male sculptors, the usual process is to make creative works and then give it to casters. So these are two different, completely, compartmentalized roles. But she would be part of the creative process, of course. She would be part of making the mold, preparing the material, making the mold from, and then finally the casting, because she knew exactly what, and all those molds, as Tapatidi said, that they've become like living entities, and she identified with each of those molds that were made. And she knew exactly what could go wrong while dewaxing. Now, as I said, dewaxing has never been a part of the indigenous casting system. Dewaxing is something that she's learned in Europe, and she would also say that the Italian cire perdu or lost wax process is like English language, which acquired different characters in different countries. So here in Calcutta, there was settlement of craftsmen, casters, who would use the basics of Italian Sirepedu lost wax process of casting, but they would use material of indigenous craftsmen, and that is also what she did in a way. But it was again a different method of casting that she practiced, and that is what made these sculptures. So today, when I see almost 2 to 3 fake works every month, I know that it's not the way that they have come up. They have come up in a different form. They have come up through a different technique, and they are being claimed. And interestingly enough, I've also thought that she could have also simulated the surface, the archaic surface, and then finally got it cast in the Italian, because that's a very standardized method of casting, and the results are predictable. But she's not done, because it would have been a synthetic way to approach the surface that she responded to, the surface that she contemplated, and it was like contemplating the archaic. Could we just... Now, these are, while she was preparing the clay was most fundamental to the process of Meera Mukherjee's casting, starting from making the core to the mold and then finally the kiln. So clay was the most fundamental material, but there were different kinds of clay, and now most of these were formed in a technique that she formulated. It was not, because the artisans would make 2 to 3 layers at the most, but here there were 7 to 8 layers of clay being put on the creative work. And now she's making the clay core, and the knowledge of making terracotta pieces also was important, because the clay core, if it is a solid core, then while firing it will burst, as simple as that. So it's just not the understanding of the artisans, but an understanding of an artist who's trained in these institutions. And she's, most of these cores are hollow inside, which helps them to fire properly. And now she's preparing the surface for the coil, the wax threads to be coiled on its surface. Now, as a sculptor myself, I've always thought that didn't she have the anxiety, because she was sharing the language of a craftsperson. And yes, in 1967 she was awarded the Master Craftsman Award by the President. She went and she accepted. I always try and ask myself that how would it been to a contemporary artist today had he or she been marked as an artisan. But it didn't bother her, because it was part of unlearning what she's learned in Germany, in Polytechnic, and at all these institutions she was faced with challenges. When she went to Germany, she, her training that she received in Polytechnic was questioned. When she came back from Germany to Calcutta and she was working with these artisans, they never trusted her initially. And that was, a struggle also, sort of to get their trust and finally get into, the process. Now here, she, her working methods were ritualistic, as it were that of the craftsperson, but the content of it was always mostly the city. It was not the village. It was always the city, and she's she's looked at Gargi as a character who comes from Upanishad, a very erudite woman who's sort of debating. This is on the one hand, and on the other hand, she's looking at the uprising of a sweeper community, mostly women, and she's taken detailed notes of the uprising. So that is the range what she's, and here again we see that a group of workers who coming from the village and settling down in the city, and then what the struggle is like, and she's portraying that struggle. So it is always a group of people in flux from the village to the city. Wax coils are being made, and often people would ask that whether these are decorations, because they produced a kind of an active surface, and she would react and would say that's its technicality, and it is of course technicality. Now very meticulously the first layer of the mold is coming up on the surface of a wax creative work, and this first layer of the clay mold is very vital, because it will finally produce a closer version of the work that was done in wax. The next, now she is putting on the clay mold on it. So there were, as I said, there were 7 to 8 layers of different kind of layers of clay that would come up. The next. Now it's a very sort of a complex process. Now these are I see sculptors here, so I know that they'll know there are risers and runners. Now risers and runners you get to see in Italian Cire Perdu, because with artisans they'll only use one channel, and you see there are quite a few, because they are bigger in size, and she would sort of she would need metal, lots of metal for, so there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 runners and 5 risers, because the space is much more than what the artisans. So the next, now this is the completed mold, and it always looked like one of those archaeological finds, and every during autumn there were about 40 to 45 molds at her Padmapukur Road residence, and it was always a sight to see, because they were all kept for drying. And now this is where she has built a kiln, and again she never had a structured foundry. They were all makeshift kilns, and every year she would make these kilns. So she never had kind of a structured foundry, because that again produced that very predictable result. Now this is dewaxing. Dewaxing is definitely not a part of indigenous casting, because indigenous casting is an integrated process where dewaxing, you don't get to see dewaxing as a separate. Preparing the kiln for melting the metal. And as I said that she was the main person for the casting as well. This is a very beautiful. Now these black and white images were taken in 1978. She was to deliver a lecture at the MS University Baroda, and that is when Arun Ganguly, a young photographer, came in and took these black and white bromides. This is she's taking out the crucible from the kiln, and now the metal is being poured. She in 1973 3, she writes that while casting Ashok was sort of a huge sculpture, she couldn't lift more than 30 kilos of metal at a time. So there were 2 crucibles that were, the metals were being molten, and then simultaneously they'll pour. This is immediately after casting, where she pours water, and then she'll break the mold to bring out the metal piece. And these moments where the molds were broken and the metal piece, they were always, a moment in itself, because she was very anxious to see what is, it's a sort of something very usual with all artists and sculptors. Next. Oh, that's all. Okay. Just one thing before I. The work process of Meera Mukherjee holds, the archaic surface of the sculpture on the one hand, definitely, and also in terms of the content, because when she was working with the welders, in Calcutta, she was also looking at the very rudimentaries, in terms of the workshop, in terms of the material, and that was definitely a part of what she brought about in her sculptures. So they were not deliberately kept like that, rough surface or crude surface. There's always a very deep sense of drawing. People only get to see the crude surface, but there's a very keen sense of drawing that they fail to see. So it's always a combination of it. On purpose, she didn't think about making it eclectic, but it was always the anonymity of ethnographic objects that attracted her, and that is what she always struggled for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Odip, for this very sort of instructive presentation. Before we open it up, maybe for a couple of questions, just a little observation. I'm very curious about one thing, which is, you spoke about outer material, and then you also spoke about inner matter. Forgive my editorial flourish. But what I'm very interested in is how when you write a book mapping the growth of an artist, do you make sense of the artist as a creature of rampant contradictions? Taupati spoke about her anxiety, you spoke about her anxiety. Taupati also spoke about how she was critical of the Bhadralok, but also a Bhadra Mahila herself. So I'm just curious about how, what is it, how do you make sense of this when you write, or when you assemble different parts in much the same way as probably the different parts of the Buddha were assembled very recently. And I'm also thinking about 2 or 3 other texts I have in mind. A text like Shahid Amin's Event Metaphor Memory, where you have the biography of an event, Chauri Chaura, in 1922. A book like Godse Bhatji's Mazha Pravas, which is a biography of the 1857 Swatantra Samar. Or a book like Richard Ellman's James Joyce, which is a biography of Joyce, but also a biography of the city of Dublin. So I'm just curious about how you have thought about this. Thanks.
It's precisely this bundle of contradictions that were erupting within her. I think that is the idea of that continuous tension, the fact that the restlessness, but also the tension. When she receives the President Craftsman Award, yes, she talks about how it's an honor to be awarded as a craftsman. But the questions that I raise is that here was a dilemma, that was she stepping in and displacing the bona fide craftsman here? Because after all, strictly speaking, she's not a craftsperson. Or in becoming a craftsperson, was she a danger of forfeiting the vantage position of her own self as a modern artist? And she was very conscious of that they were her team, but she is the person without whom not a single work would move from the drawing to any of the stage. So yes, I think there's no question that she is a Bhadra Mahila. There are many stories, you think of several artists trying to declass themselves, from Jamini Roy to several others, Paul Gauguin and all, and that tension, that ethnographic eye is one, the deep empathy is another. Her turning to Buddhism and her search for the master craftsman, the figure of Vishwakarma among them, is part of her own journey from the material to the spiritual, I will say, because there is a lot of the last works is also deeply immersive. There's always immersiveness in a work, but I think this was there. In fact, Arup Sengupta in an interview would say that there were people who would have that confidence to tease her, saying, sometimes you're a communist, sometimes you're a Buddhist, which one are you today? Barin Shah would say it. But she would also throw them out of the house if she displeased with them. So this idea of negotiating multiple worlds, Nirmal Bose was a Gandhian, Nirmal Sengupta is a communist, a trade unionist leader. She is part of many worlds. But one thing which fascinated me about Elachi is that if Bastar was one field, I think Elachi becomes another field, a field where she, consciously or not, tries to build a notion of a commune, an art commune, where her family, for somebody who otherwise had no direct family, yes, siblings and all, her with the children, her with the women, they become an extended kinship. Now you could well say that kinship is something that many people will today actually have huge problems with, right? What is this kinship we create with our workers? It hides many things, right? Now, when you work, it is more collaborative, it is often more contractual, but the hierarchies remain. But her sense of kinship was there, and therefore, I feel it's quite telling that she died in Elachi while working on a Buddha, almost in a frenzy, surrounded by her works and by these figures. She was far away from the city. So that contradiction, that she was part of so many worlds while claiming the space of difference for self, to me, made her a much more interesting figure. Her vulnerability. In her diaries, she talks about weeping when her work doesn't come out well, how she has to borrow money to pay a welder when something breaks. This struggle is there, and yet she's immensely learned. She reads, her diaries tell her about her reading European literature. She knows languages. Her taste for music is extremely refined. So look at the different worlds she inhabits. So she is not insincere in any of these. I will not use that term, but the tensions and contradictions are everywhere for me. And that's why, to me, she belongs to this period. If you think of her life, it traverses the entire 20th century. So from an elite background, to reinvent herself as an artisan, but an artist too. And I think you could say, yes, I don't look outside her at the larger work of modern art. I'm hoping there are other works that have done it a bit better, and there could be far more work done on this. But I do believe that it was a journey through the life of a transforming middle class of the 20th century. I think the contradictions that she lives with are those that so many artists, writers, intellectuals, we and our subject are there. So that's what I will say, but
this contradiction is very central to her practice. Not that there isn't criticism today, because this model has also been looked at critically. An upper class woman going down to artisans and taking, but the Dalit politics was not so was not the way it has come up today. So it was kind of, but I'll tell you one reason. I believe it is that it's that broken marriage that was also very central to her character and the contradiction. I was just telling her today in the morning, this is what I've got from one of the sisters. Her husband, because they were not divorced. The husband died in 1970, and she was making the Ashok. She was penniless, absolutely, and the entire property came to her. She wrote, I'm talking of the honesty of a person, and she writes it down that I lay no claim on his property. I've never loved nor respected this man in my lifetime. So that is where the honesty lies. And yes, I would say in the 1940s, that broken marriage, of course, again within that format of the Bhadralok community, it did sort of something to her character, and as she wonderfully said, the vulnerability.
Once she said, why did you leave the group of women artists? She said most of the women, and they did need a platform in the 80s, they came together. She said they usually talk about Shangshar, which is household. Those are the domains that tie them down, and they want to talk about them and why they need a platform outside that, and why the male studio space is not theirs. And she said, I came away because I have no Shangshar and I did not want to discuss. But I would say she was deeply invested in running a household, very frugally. But what each and, when the workers were going to be casting, she insisted on chicken with their meals every day. That kind of element of care. She talks about children falling sick, she not being able to do anything. So that kinship became, her larger home and household. But this idea that she was single was there, and her deep insecurity. And this is again something that comes through, that she would be thrown out by Nirmal Sengupta's children. That they actually were very fond of her, but that insecurity was always with her. That what happens if he dies, and he was a lot older than her, will I be allowed to stay on here? She died and he lived on to be 100. So think of these deep insecurities of a single woman in a non-conventional relationship, which despite his complete commitment to her, she was always in a sense of insecurity. And to me that is so telling, that it would not be there in the same way in a male artist. The sense of kinship would be different. So I tried to see it, maybe it's not overt, but it is not just to celebrate her life as a great artist, but to think of her as part of all of this. I think that is there.
Human, I would say. Extremely human, because as he said that, this fear of being thrown out of the house, both Padmapukur Road, because that was a rented property, and the studio at Elachi, it haunted her. So these are, and she never hesitated in expressing. She never hesitated in bringing that chaos while she was making working on the surface of a sculpture. So it was, I would say, very honest, very human, and that is you know, today we see the contradiction, and it is there, of course, and it defines, you know, the physical aspect of the sculptures very much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tapati and Adi, for this very perspicacious insights into her inner lives, replete with all kinds of demons, all kinds of terrifying presences, anxieties. May I open the session now for just a couple of questions, very quick questions, in case somebody wants to. Yes, Neha?
No, it's okay.
Thanks, thanks, Abhay. I guess I have a question. I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with the one perhaps that Tapati might be able to answer. You talked about the contradictions, and you also talked about her rejection of being categorized as a woman artist, at the same time dealing with the aspects of being a woman and all that entails. Perhaps I'm going to expand this from the sort of very identity-based idea to thinking about her as a grounded person, grounded in the culture, grounded in the local, grounded in the histories of her place, grounded in the spiritualities of the inheritances. And still, she's at a pivotal moment in India's history. What did she make of the project of the nation, which is a very different project from the cultural project of being Indian?
I think in the essay of Shomik Bandyopadhyay, he mentions this network of intellectuals she begins to interact with. And I think the fact that she's builds around her working team and considers her working team as part of her family is one side. But we cannot ignore that there is a circle of intellectuals, scholars, writers, filmmakers who are part of a salon in Bhawanipur and in Elachi. They come, they're not always welcome, there are days when she talks to them, but there is an intellectual world and it's there. She's watching films, she's seeing a Badal Sarkar play, she's seeing a Barin Shah, who's a very unconventional filmmaker. David Mukherjee, scholar of temple architectures, coming to her. Stella Crambrish is a person who's first encouraging her to work in an enlarged scale. She has a community of scholars and collectors and writers with whom she's in conversation. With Nirmal Sengupta, there is an intellectual world she inhabits too. So I think that is there in that sense. There is that side to her, and that world of scholarship is something that she is imbibing in different ways. So I'm thinking therefore then of her location as a woman, would be positioned here. But you're right that, in some ways the problems are very much of, that sense, that cultural capital, if we could use that term, is there. And it's deeply embedded in her. Oh, the nation, yeah, sorry, I was somewhere lost the thread. So that moment in the 60s, that moment in the 60s is when different people are seeking out an alternative nation. So Nirmal Bose, who's a Gandhian, is invested in thinking about caste and community very closely. David Mukherjee, a scholar of comparative literature, is coming to teach Bengali and discovering a village India. I think it's not a conscious political nationalism, but that agenda that why does she return from Europe? Because I must find my language within my own country's tradition. So it's not an overt nationalism, but I think and they go on Indian-German in scholarships. I don't know that they are part of a national in the sense that there is a broader framework of the national, say, within which a Hussein or a Raza would be working in the same years, where the national would be something where you're breaking out of certain trainings. So that she wanted to break out of her Indian style painting, of European modernism purely is there. I have no easy answer because this nation is not in many ways it's a recognizable nation where you recognize the other, the working poor, the rural poor and the urban poor, as a site of higher knowledge, better values, of authenticity, all of that, right? She feels that there's greater, this work without seas is there. And I suppose that is a kind of alternative nation. I don't think she's really talking about, I suppose the time when she truly discovers India is when she travels. That is when that diversity of even the casting techniques come through of languages. But the nation, I suppose, here is, it's an important question in the 50s and 60s, the importance of the nation and now, but also the burden of having to be Indian and modernist is there everywhere. I don't think Indianness bothers her in the same way, but the search for an alternative does. I don't know whether that quite answers the nation.
No, she was not in favor of the nation state, not much. And definitely, today, of course, there's a huge risk of discussing nationalism, and she was definitely not a nationalist in the popular sense. She was more on the side of Guru Sadai Dutt, who was talking of the local culture and the culture that you belong to. And it is again, and that is where the stance of an anthropologist comes. And but she was definitely not a nationalist in the sense of Nandalal Bose. So, especially when she talks about Afandi, she says that there was a difference between, of opinion between Nandalal and Afandi. She says that Nandalal was fond of Shandesh, and she says that I am also fond of Shandesh, and Afandi was fond of, those dried fish, and she says that she hated those. Yet she knows that Afandi is right here. So.
The other thing to think is that there are no big national commissions she ever takes on. If you think of it, even Ramkinkar Bej is ultimately doing the Reserve Bank sculpture as a project. Also, she's not really even doing a Gandhi of that scale like she does. Her Ashoka is an allegorical figure. It's not the Ashoka which would later be, it's also being claimed. So I think the fact that she works outside an official frame is also important, that none of her large works are commissioned pieces. The Buddha was initially meant to be for a buyer, but it far exceeded the time, the scale, the money. So that sense, even for other modernist sculptors of the time, there is no truck with the larger, that's establishment.
Yeah, I think it's important to listen to the silences in a way, right? So what she's not doing also tells you something about what she is actually attracted to and invested in. So thank you for that answer, both of you.
Thank you, Tapti, Adip, and Abhay, for a very engaging discussion, which has left me wanting more, which I think is a great compliment. Thank you, Gallery 88, for publishing the book, and thank you all for coming here this evening. Thank you.
I'd just like to say one thing. The Bhadraloks had a day, that was Saturday, that she would meet them. But Shupriya definitely comes from that quintessence Bhadralok, but she was allowed, Monday, Sunday, Wednesday. So that explains also. Yes.
Also, just to no, not at all. I think one of the great regrets we have, even as we were working on the book, is that there is no estate of Meera Mukherjee. When she died, because there was no family and no permanent home, whatever remained came from Elachi to Bhavanipur and then was dispersed. So even today we feel that one major, and I'm saying this as a historian and archivist, we do need a full inventory of all the works that exist. They keep moving between collections, but it is very important to really have a sense, because there's a huge repertoire of work, it's a huge production, but there is nobody who owns them anymore. So there was no family and estate. So it began, it's therefore now part of galleries and collectors, private, institutional, and that work of inventorying remains to be done. And the day we have that inventorying, the faking will also be a more risky proposition. Anyway, on that note, thank you all for being with us for so long.